Welcome to Studium Generale of the TU Delft and the World at War lecture series. My name is Klaas van der Tempel, and our guest today is a very versatile man who has spoken for SG before. We have with us Haroon Sheikh, a political scientist at the WRR, which is the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy. He's also a teacher, a philosopher, and a financial advisor. And he's the author of several books, including, which was an interesting book for us, The Rise of the East, Eurasia and the New World Order, which is available in Dutch. Together with us in the studio is my colleague Meerte Golverdingen. She's off camera for now, you can't see her, because of corona distancing, but we'll be switching places later on in the lecture so we can each take turns asking Haroon some questions. So for today's talk, we've asked Haroon to tell us about the rise of China as a global superpower. There are big changes afoot in world politics, and that seems to be making a lot of countries nervous. A new world order is coming, and that has consequences for each and every one of us. Haroon, welcome back to Delft, and please tell us, what should we expect from China in the coming years? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Klaas. Thank you also, Meerte. Thank you for the kind invitation to be here. And it's a pleasure to be back here at Studium Generale in Delft and to give this introduction before we get into our conversation. So the theme that was discussed for today is the idea of it's about the rise of China. And the second part of the announcement for the event was, will there be a conflict between East and West? And we often see these things coming together. The rise of China being associated with the conflict between the East and the West. And I'd like to start first with that second part, because of course I'll come back to China, and that's the main topic of this talk also. But the idea that the rise of China somehow represents a conflict between East and West is something we need to analyze a bit further. Where does this idea come from? I think the idea became quite prominent in the early 90s. With the end of the Cold War, people were wondering what is going to be the new source of conflict, the new kind of division between countries worldwide, as the ideological conflict of the Cold War was waning. It was then that Samuel Huntington proposed this idea of a clash of civilizations. And he said, well, it's not going to be ideology, it's going to be culture or civilization that distinguishes the different blocks in the world, China representing its own Confucian culture, and the West being something of a different culture that is going to battle with it much more, just like, as he prophesied, there will be battles with Islamic civilization, etc., etc. This idea of Huntington was proposed in the 90s, and it's coming back again a lot. Why? Because of the rise of China. And people don't think don't think it's about ideology. China, officially, it's a communist country, but of course, it's not really communism that China is proposing worldwide. So this idea is growing that China has a certain value system that's more cultural, that's like, you could say, an Eastern value system, and that value system is opposed to our Western value system. Now, that seems plausible and everything, but I would argue there are at least three problems with that framing. First of all, the idea that the Western values that we're thinking about in this context, I think that's an idea that's too simple and we too easily identify what we believe to be Western values. If we talk about it, we often say things like, well, in the West, we believe in democracy and liberal rights, women's rights, gays' rights, all these kind of things. These are part of the West values, and the East doesn't accept them. Well, just looking first at the West here, I think that view is problematic, or at least it's way too simple. Democracy in the West, yes, many countries, Western countries or European countries are democracies. But we mustn't forget, of course, what a long time it took them to get there. And really, up far into the 20th century, democracy was contested within Europe by communism, by fascism. It's really very recent that democracy has become a fact in many Western countries. And all the other values that we're talking about, women's rights, very recent. Often in the conflict it said, well, the West protects minorities or people like LGBT community. Also here, right? It's still in the 1950s that the United Kingdom sterilized Alan Turing, the famous computer scientist, for being gay. My point here is not to say, well, to criticize the West, say, oh, Western countries, their values are faulty or somehow. My point is to say, what we now consider to be essentially Western values are historical facts, very recent facts. And it's important to see that, because otherwise we might think, well, these are our values and we've had them forever, and others don't have them, so they won't ever have them. And just showing how the West is actually quite more complex helps us understand that possibly countries in the East might come closer to these values as well, just as the West learned through long experience. Second problem with the idea of saying, well, we're talking about a conflict between Western and Eastern values is this idea of the East. Often what we're talking about here is China, right? That's what people are thinking of. But the East, or Asian countries, countries in East Asia, it's much more complex. We're talking about much more different countries. The world's biggest democracy is in Asia. It's India. And India, we might say, well, that's in terms of values or history, it's closer to us. But also countries, you could say, in terms of history and culture, very similar to China, also aren't that distinct from us as we would think. Think, for instance, of countries like Japan or South Korea, Taiwan. Countries that share, for instance, China's Confucian history, its Buddhist legacy. But these countries are democracies, well-working democracies, have liberal rights, and in many ways share a world view and of many of the values that we cherish. So what we put in the Western values, a lot of it can be found in the East as well. So let's not make the East too much of, well, that's this authoritarian, non-privacy respecting, and et cetera type of world. Last problem with this framing of the West versus the East is it's too simple a view of China itself. So it's not just that you have countries like Japan and South Korea that share many more of the values, but China itself, we shouldn't also see it too much as a monolith with one type of values. Even the regime itself is quite complex. The ideas that there are, the Communist Party speaks of democracy as well. Of course, they mean something different from what we mean, but it's not that it's this one group that says, well, dictatorship, that's our policy, and that's the value system we cherish. The regime is more complex, but of course, the regime is not the people of China. And there are many different groups within China that have values, that have programs that are quite similar to us. And if we, and this is I think really important, if we put a wall between their values and our values, we inhibit ourselves to see these other groups that are actually quite close to us. So it's not just a theoretical point saying, well, China is more complex and you have different ideologies or different types of values in China. But it also, very practically, it means that we can look for much more affinity with groups within China and also within its history, because China has a rich history. It's not just the regime or the type of policies that we see. It's a country with a tremendous long wealth of different ideas, philosophies, many ideas that I believe can actually be very fruitfully combined with beliefs about democracy, about individual values, about humanism. But maybe we'll come back to that in the conversation later on. This was just the first point I want to make, because when we're talking about China and competition with it, we shouldn't equate that with West versus East. So let's now go to China proper, right? Now we've settled this idea of it's not about the East versus the West. With China itself, yes, I mean, there is increasing competition, especially China versus the United States. So what's going on here? And let me just very briefly sketch this out a bit. We come from a situation of the end of the Cold War, where the United States was, early 1990s, the world's supreme world power. And at that time, China was still, in the early 90s, China's economy was about the size of Belgium, smaller than that of the Netherlands. But China had already, after Mao Zedong's death, started to open up its economy. Basically, when Deng Xiaoping started his reform policies in 1978, the country started on what you could say is a capitalist path, and its economy started to grow at a growth rate that's unprecedented. We're talking about 10+% growth a year for decades. This is really something the world has never seen, and especially not on this scale of such a big country. As a result, China is increasingly becoming a vast economy. It's now the second economy in the world. I think it's just a few decades from the size of Belgium. It surpasses all these European countries, then Japan, and now it's just only the United States is ahead of it. So China's economy is growing rapidly, and this is causing tensions globally. China is expanding as a result of its economy getting bigger and bigger. It's getting more influential worldwide. It needs all kinds of resources. It's increasing trade. So we're seeing it influencing all kinds of other countries all around the world. And the United States. There's also this idea growing that really a conflict with China is brewing and that this conflict is inevitable. And really, this is something we must realize. This is not something that, well, Trump invented as president and that now could go away with all the rest of his rhetoric. This really is the one thing all important politicians in the United States agree on, that the United States is in a competition with China. If you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat, this is the one thing they agree on. So here, indeed, tension is growing. The United States being the supreme world power, a country that for over a century has become used to the fact that it's the number one in everything, is feeling China's breath getting closer. And I believe, my opinion, within a few years' time, China will surpass the United States as the world's largest economy. Of course, like any country, China can have an economic crisis, setbacks, but the drivers of China's economic transformation are deep and fundamental. Crisis can set it back a few years, but China is on its way to become even a very big economy. It will surpass the United States, it will surpass the EU, and it will at some time really become an economic center of the world system. So this in itself is creating tension worldwide. We're seeing already competition between the United States and China. It's been there under the radar, but the last few years, especially since the Trump presidency, it's become very prominent. And tension is building in all kinds of fields. In the military field, for instance. And maybe just have a look in a bit at what this looks like. I mean, China is indeed, it's expanding its military, it's expanding its personnel, its investments. But still here, I think that's important to note, China is still very far behind the United States. That's just one reason why we won't have to expect conflict coming just from the Chinese side. China is expanding its investments in its military. At the same time, I mean, China's military expenditure is less than a third of that of the United States. And its military is way less advanced than that of the United States. And also very important, it has very little experience. China's military experience goes back to fighting in the jungles of Vietnam and the local war against the Japanese. The United States military has experience throughout the 20th century fighting wars all around the world. So China militarily, the competition is growing, but let's keep it in perspective. It's still way behind the United States here. At the maritime level, also, China is increasingly expanding its role. This is something in my most recent book, Hydropolitics, I write about, the competition that's brewing on the world's seas. All around the world, there's this competition for influence on the world's waters, and China is a very important player here. And you only need to think about things like, probably you've heard of, the harbor of Piraeus in Greece, where China has these 2 terminals and has a kind of a gateway within Europe. The important harbor in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in Malaysia, all around the world, China is increasing its maritime presence. At the same time here too, China is still very far behind the United States. China is currently building its 3rd aircraft carrier, just to give an example of, like, you could say the most powerful piece of military hardware on the oceans, an aircraft carrier. China is building its 3rd. The United States has tens of them all around the world, and it's been operating them since the 1940s, very professionally. So China still also here has a long way to go, but yes, here also there's competition. This is in the military fields. The most important field where you can see these countries clashing with each other is more on the economic field. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think that's important also for the series we're having here. What does conflict look like nowadays? I would argue it has a lot more to do with economics than it did in the past. But we're seeing at least the hints of it everywhere, right? The US-Chinese trade war that Trump started and that Biden is continuing is all about this. The conflict over chip industries and trying to create supply chains that go beyond China or that cut off Chinese imports, all parts of this competition. And China's idea of using its rare earth metals is also one part of Chinese influence it has on the economic field being used within the geopolitical space. Because of this competition in different fields, in the military, or at sea, within the economic realm, we're also seeing that this has impact on international relations. China itself has proposed this big idea of new international relations, which is called the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot to be said about this, but it's put simply, it's the biggest plan of rearranging global relations since the Marshall Plan at the end of the Second World War. With the Belt and Road, China is proposing all kinds of economic linkages through Eurasia towards Russia, but also through the Islamic world, through Southeast Asia, towards South Asia, all parts of the world, and there's even a polar Silk Road that extends all the way up to the North Pole. So China is proposing a new economic architecture for the world, rearranging international relations, and that's something the United States obviously isn't a fan of, and that it's seeking to counter more and more in the last few years. So where does this lead to? Where are we heading here for? Well, there's been an interesting book about this a few years ago by the Harvard professor Graham Allison. It's a book called Destined for War, ? And he speaks in this book about what he calls the Thucydides trap. And the trap is basically something that the historian Thucydides discerned when analyzing the conflict between Athens and Sparta, that when you have a situation where you have a ruling world power and there is other emerging power that is quickly increasing its influence, it's almost impossible to stop war from happening. He analyzed many cases from the past, and he said, well, in all but 2 or 3 cases, this situation always led to war. He's not saying war between the United States and China is inevitable. He is saying that there are very strong forces driving these countries towards war. And what's the dynamic? Well, what causes this? Basically, he says the different outlook that these countries have make it increasingly difficult for them to see eye to eye. Concretely, whenever China is growing its influence, it's getting economically more sophisticated, it will ask for the rest of the world to respect it a bit more, to give it a bit more space. That's what it says, well, we're more economically relevant. Let's have more voting power in the World Bank. Let's have more voting power in the IMF. Let's change all these ways, these institutions within the United Nations. Now, from the US perspective, they cannot but see this as an attempt by China to break down the world that the United States created. So for their perspective, everything that China does is undermining. China, on the other hand, will look at this all the time and say, well, we're just asking what's normal, considering that we're getting more influential. And then China will look at what the United States is doing and saying, hey, what you're doing actually, trying to stop us here, is that you're trying to undermine us as a country that is just seeking to become more wealthy and have better status. So both countries have it. The United States will always interpret everything that China does as an attempt of undermining its status. And China, on the other hand, will look at everything the United States does and will see it as an attempt to block China from emerging. And this situation will every step of the way get deeper and more complex. So this is the Thucydides trap. War becomes more likely every step as we go further. Again, Allison doesn't say war is necessary, but he does say the path to war is something we're moving towards. So it's not something that just happens if we make an accident. It's actually the thing that we're heading towards. So the effort needs to go in preventing that. That is possible, but that's at least, war is not something that can happen through mistakes. War is something that happens because these countries are more and more on a collision course. Let me say a few more things and then I'll rounding up. Let me make 2 or 3 more points. First is, if we're looking at what kind of world this will be, we do see China and the United States increasingly getting into competition with each other. What you're often hearing nowadays is that we're heading towards a new Cold War. And indeed, many people around us are saying that. The United States, often many voices from Washington are arguing that we're in a new Cold War with China. I think this is the wrong metaphor. First of all, because we're not in a situation of ideological conflict. As I said, it's not communism versus capitalism. It's not that we're talking here with a country that has a completely different ideology and is seeking to rearrange the world according to its image. At least not yet do we have a sign that that's what it is about. But also, and this is more important, in contrast with the Cold War, we're now talking about one globalized economy in which China, the United States, and the rest of the world are deeply intertwined. During the Cold War, we had two basically separated systems. A little bit of oil and agriculture products went back and forth, but that was it. You had the communist economic system and you had the capitalist economic system. That situation now is radically different. What we're now facing a situation is where the largest economy in the world in a few years' time is going to be a country that has, in terms of values, many things that is problematic for us. But that's different from the Cold War, where it was also a country that we were economically detached from. So our situation now is much more complex. We cannot simply detach from China in a way that was very easily possible during the Cold War. What does that mean? And that's my next point. We're not heading for a second Cold War. What we are heading for, I think, is that we're going to see war and conflict having a different type of shape, different dynamics. And here I'm coming back to something I said before. One interesting lens to look at world politics now is that we're seeing a phenomenon that you could call geoeconomics. And geoeconomics, as you could say, it's basically a mix of an economic logic and a geopolitical logic. And the Cold War was really a geopolitical logic, armies against each other, competition in terms of who has the most nuclear weapons. And we had this economic logic after the Cold War, where we said, well, let's everyone integrate economically, free trade, globalization. And now we're seeing something that actually fuses elements of both together, and that makes conflict something very much economic. It means that whereas for quite a long time we thought economic integration will make us more similar, will make conflict less possible, that was the idea that we had until recently. I think what we're seeing now is that the economy that indeed links us all together is more and more becoming subject to conflict. And we're seeing that at these small places already, right? Like the chip competition between the United States and China. We're seeing it in terms of telecommunication infrastructure, like Huawei, countries asking, should we, like the Netherlands as well, should we have these telecommunication infrastructure or not? But I would say this is going to go through the entire economy, all these different places. That's where conflict is going to go for. We're not really going to have a situation, perhaps at some time in the future, we'll also have tanks and ships positioned against each other. More realistically, I would argue, is that we're going to see these large economic logics in which countries are trying to undercut the other or trying to exploit an asymmetrical dependence that the other has. Well, this is also something we can dive into later on, but I would say this is really the way conflict is getting a different shape. Let me round off, final point, because, and I think also a way to kick off the discussion further. I would argue, so this conflict, it's not the Cold War conflict. It's something that is much more what I call a geo-economic logic. There's this interesting book by two Chinese colonels written, I think in 1999, so quite a while ago, which I think provides an interesting insight into the world we're heading towards. And it also shows that the Chinese were thinking about this quite a while ago. The book is called Unrestricted Warfare. And I think that says something quite a lot about the world that we're heading towards. Because what they say in this book, this is not just going to be the classic warfare about planes and bombs. It's also not just going to be warfare, say cyber warfare. Say, well, that's obviously that's going to be a part of it. Cyber warfare, cyber attacks, digital systems being used. But that's a part of it. That doesn't define conflict in its full entirety. Unrestricted warfare basically means that we're now going to see countries seeking to exploit all the different chains that we have around the world, all the different systems that we have in society are going to be searched for weaknesses to apply to other countries. So it can be, say, partly cyber warfare, but it can also be something like, say, a country like Russia has done, trying to manipulate people's use of social media. It can be about looking for weaknesses in infrastructure. It can be about trying to mobilize different groups of people in other countries, often even unknowingly that they're being used in this way. Unrestricted warfare is this idea of a society in which all these different systems, from classical military to economics to law to social dynamics, all being used and looked for combinations in ways to get one's goals internationally. So this is, I think, something. It's a book we should read. An interesting but also a very speculative book about the future of conflict. But it also goes back, I think, and that's also what makes it interesting, to what you could say is like the oldest maxim of Chinese statecraft. China has for centuries has a very rich literature on statecraft and competition with other countries, and the highest maxim there has always been win the battle without fighting. So this could be, I'd say, partly it's good news because it means China is not really out for battle. It doesn't want to fight, but that doesn't mean it's not in it to win. It's just trying to win by making sure it doesn't have to fight first. So we need to be smart about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Haroon. That's a very big overview of a huge topic in, I think, under 30 minutes. Fantastic. I kind of want to boil it down for myself as well, because it's such a big topic. To understand the conflicts and where they're going, could you say something about what China really wants, what motivates it? Or should we say Chinese government, maybe?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are different levels and different dynamics here. I mean, there's China itself says often, and I think there's merit to that, that it's not seeking to try to impose its will on the rest of the world.
You mean in sense of values, ideology?
Yeah, that's actually something China says very often. It says, well, that's what the West still does. If the West is helping countries in Africa, they're saying how they need to organize politics. We're saying, well, you can do your own thing. We're just here for the deal. So I think there's merit to that, but that's also, I think, something that has to do with China's position in the world system. If you are an emerging power, you really, you always want to make sure that everyone has as much freedom as possible. If you are a ruling power, it's different. Then you're in a different position. So China, and this is the same for countries like Russia, they're always focusing on things like multipolarity, giving everyone as much freedom, because that basically means weakening the power of the strongest country, the United States. So there's a bit of a instrumental logic here as well. But what does China in essence want? I think here again, the good news is I don't think it's a country really looking for world domination. I don't think there's this idea. There's definitely not, at least at the moment, some kind of militaristic view like we had with powers in the past, like the Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, like Imperial Japan. That's not there. But, and I think that's something we do need to be aware of, in this integrated economic system that we have, if a country gets more influence, if it becomes economically more advanced, its will be more influential on other countries. It's not that China might say it doesn't want to influence other countries, but if its oil import will, just like the United States happens, if it's very strongly dependent on a few countries, and China has the ability to influence those countries, I have no doubt it will influence them, just like the United States has done as well. So if you are this very powerful economy, and China is becoming that, that gives you leverage in these different parts of the world, and that influence will be translated also in China trying to push through its goals. That will happen around the world. It will also happen closer to home. And so although I don't think China has like this, or at least for so far as there is something like China, but that it isn't a country really focusing on a plan for domination, but there is this logic going on that will increasingly make sure that what it wants will increasingly be more influential around the world.
Could I posit in the most simplest sense and the benign sense that China wants to grow? Because it's a natural process to grow, right? Any country would want to do that, and they want the freedom to be able to.
Yeah, that's what China says also a lot. I mean, and I mean that makes sense. I mean, it comes from really a position of poverty right. at the end of the Cultural Revolution. And that's, I said in the beginning, I believe that China's growth is inevitable. That's mostly because of this. because China is still economically very far behind, and it's still converging. It's still moving a lot of people from rural areas to urban areas. These people want to have a better lifestyle, want to have more resources, longer lives, all these kind of things. And this will drive China's growth. That you don't need a master plan for that. You just will make this country will become more influential because it's seeking to converge economically.
So we're in the middle of this global transition of economic power. We're also in a global climate crisis. I want to bring it a bit closer to home. What does this mean for Europe when China rises as it is doing?
So China's influence has been growing steadily around the world. I mentioned the example of the harbor of Piraeus. That's just a small part of it. It's already getting really quite influential throughout Europe. China has this format. I'm not sure what it's called now. Is it called 13 plus 1 or 14 plus 1? I'm not sure because it adds countries all the time. But this is this format where China engages Eastern and Central Europe and Southern Europe, all these countries. And the plus one is China itself. So it says these countries together with China. In this format, China is already having a lot of influence in countries from the Baltic states to Hungary, Greece, the Balkans. Getting these countries economically more connected with China. Now, recently, of course, also vaccine diplomacy. Hungary, a country that's turning towards Chinese vaccines. And this is already giving it influence within the European Union. Countries like Hungary and Greece have already decided not to vote in certain types of European policies very much against China. So this influence is already having an influence on Europe's policymaking process.
So when the EU wants to make a fist about European values that we talked about, right, democracy, human rights, etc., it's like shaking your fist at a giant. And even amongst our own continent, there's already dissent.
Yeah, there is dissent, and China uses this influence that it already has. That doesn't mean that I think Europe is helpless. First of all, I think in what we're seeing in Europe now is a process of quite late, but at least Europe is waking up here. So it was, I think, about 1.5, 2 years ago, Europe presented its China policy. And basically there it says, well, China falls into 3 categories. It's in some senses, China is an economic partner, or a partner in other fields like climate change. We can work together with them a lot. In other parts, China is a competitor, say in the field of economics and building cars or chips and those kind of things. And in others, it's a systemic rival. And that's the most critical one. That's the one where you say, well, in fields like human rights, there we're actually really at odds with China. So what we're seeing is a European-China policy is emerging. A bit late, I would argue, but it is emerging. And it might be that Europe has more potential to speak with one voice in the future. So I think that's, I would say, positive from a European perspective. Secondly, you mentioned your fist against a giant. There's this classical saying by a Belgian politician. He said something like Europe is an economic giant. It's a political dwarf, and it's a military worm. That was his framing. I think it was a Belgian foreign minister. Well, I think that he said it a while ago, but to an extent, it's still true. But if it's true what I argued before, that we're heading in an era of geoeconomics, not geopolitics, but geoeconomics, and that really influence and competition is going much more through the economy than to simply your military power, then Europe's being an economic giant actually might give more influence than we might believe. So that for me is the second reason why I think, well, we might still be this warm, but in this new arena of conflict, Europe actually has better cards than we think.
Huh. Interesting. I'm going to give the floor to Mirte to ask the next question.
Yeah, Haroon, thanks so much for your talk so far. You really talked a big deal about how the conflict would look like and that it would not be a Cold War or something we would expect. But that triggered to me something, what if we could resolve that conflict? You thought, well, that conflict is a bit of inevitable maybe. But do you see ways where it is possible to have 2 superpowers, China and USA, and maybe also Europe, as you told, it's more powerful than thinks it is, living together and also having economically peace or geo-economical peace? Or do you think that there needs to be some kind of conflict there? It's maybe a bit more philosophic question, but that triggered me when you talked about that conflict, that it is inevitable.
Yeah. So I think this is interesting. I mean, of course, obviously, no one can have a view of where this is going, so it's all speculation. But I would argue, I think Graham Allison makes a point, but he does say a destined for war question mark. So it's not absolutely inevitable. What I do take from his argument is that it is very probable, or at least we're heading towards it. And if we want to evade it, it requires a lot of effort, because the normal way things are going is the wrong way. So I do think that's for me the first point. The normal way things are going is towards more conflict. We've seen that in the last few years. Suddenly, China has become this like evil empire in much of our media, and I think that will continue. That's just the way. Especially the United States itself is really also engaging with China in that way. So this will increase. But are there ways to resolve this? I mean, and especially, could other countries have a part in this? It's difficult. I think a world that is truly multipolar, where there are many different poles, it's a very delicate balance that you need to create then. But if we look in terms of historical analogies, I would argue don't look at the Cold War, don't look at this period, say from 1945 to 1990. What I think would be a more adequate comparison would be, say, the world at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Now that ended with the First World War. But I'm not talking about the period before that. There you have a situation where you actually have, you could say, world power is distributed. At that time, you had the United States was already the biggest economy in the world, but the United Kingdom was still the financial center of the world, and it had the most powerful military. But Germany was rising up, also getting a powerful military and being very innovative. You had Japan in the east coming up, and this was delicate. So you had all these kind of local conflicts, but there was something of a balance. And I think what we're going towards is something very similar to that, where you have, say, economic dynamism really concentrated with China, but the US will remain the military power in the world for perhaps decades ahead. And we'll try to have to balance that all these countries have their different strengths. And if we can find ways to let each have their own sphere, that might be a way to a bit alleviate that tension, but it will be hard.
Yeah, so you say it's all about balance, and maybe you're wondering, the rise of China is not something that was like surprising, but it is something that we only see in the media for like the last 5 years maybe, and before that it was just a bit like the big country there in the east that produces very cheap stuff for us, and which is very handy for our capitalistic way of life. So maybe in that viewpoint, did we underestimate China, and did that increase the conflict we have now, that we thought, we don't have to take them maybe that serious as we seem to have to do now?
Absolutely. I think we've gotten China completely wrong for a very long time. It was really ideology driving our view of China. It was the idea that, and I think still many people have that, it's an authoritarian country, so basically what they do is follow orders, and if they make something, it's cheap production. It's copying what we do. So let's just let them we can get cheap goods from there, but all the interesting stuff, we'll keep making that. We'll export it to them, and they'll buy it for so we learned, wait a second, it's not it's not that simple. It's actually, the country is much more innovative, much more creative, and I think we're slowly getting used to that, but there's still so much more. I mean, if you look at the use of social media platforms, I would argue China is more advanced than, say, the United States social media platform. The things people do on WeChat, with Baidu, with Alibaba, it actually is way further, and there are many different fields. So I would say China is more innovative. And I think the second thing that we really got wrong, we underestimated its innovative, its creative potential. And the second is, we thought that if China gets wealthier, well, they'll just start to be more like us. And so it's not a problem. Even if they get more wealthy, well, they just want the same things like us, and they'll just travel and stuff, and not really a competitor. And I think what we underestimate there, and I think we underestimate it with many parts of the world, is that you really need to look at the country's historical experience. China has a very profound history, a very complex and subtle civilization. And it has for quite a while really been in a weak position globally. What it calls itself the century of humiliation, starting with the Opium Wars in the 1850s, where basically the English forced China to buy opium because there was nothing else the English made that the Chinese wanted. And China is getting back on the world stage. It wants at least once again a recognition that it is an advanced and important country. So that means it won't just say, well, we'll try to be like the West. It'll actually increase its pride in its own country, its own traditions. So yes, I think we've gotten China completely wrong, and we've had these misconceptions about it. And as a result, that now indeed we're shaking up and we're waking up like, okay, and now we quickly need to go in overdrive with scaremongering about China. But now I'd say we also there need to have a bit more moderation. Yes, there are many things to worry about, but a lot of things China does is just a natural way of things are going. I would argue any country this big becoming economically more developed, it will require from us some adaptation. We can't expect China to live in the world that we created where European countries and the United States ruled everything. We need to adapt a bit if it's going to, otherwise we're going to have more conflict.
Yeah, so that I think my next question would be, and that's following what you're saying, how would such a Pax China, maybe we say, look like if China becomes maybe the most important country or state in the world? What would we expect it? And maybe we can start at the Belt and Road Initiative, where we see it in like Asia and maybe also in Eastern Europe. But how would it look like, and what kind of initiatives do you see from China already?
Yeah, so there is this, I could say something like this idea of a new Pax Sinica, which the Belt and Road is one example. Another word for that is the new Silk Road, which apart from having a nice historical connotation of countries cooperating, trading goods all around, it also has an added benefit for China rhetorically, because the Silk Road, remember what that existed before Columbus found his route to the United States, right? So it's a very nice way for China to say, well, our ideal is this world, which in the past, by the way, was a time when the United States didn't exist. So it can like push China off the United States off the map just by going back to a time before the United States was discovered. So that's, I think, a rhetorical force that the Silk Road has that it's not acknowledged enough. But anyway, so with this Silk Road, China is again trying to create these new links, and this Silk Road it's a very complex concept. Every time China updates it and puts in new countries.
Yeah, because maybe you can explain just into a few sentences, what is this Silk Road? What is it?
Yeah, so the Silk Road now is called the Belt and Road. So it has a belt and the road. It's kind of misleading. The road is not on the road is on the water. That's the maritime road, and the belt is on land. And in some of its plans, China has like 6 lines that go over land. One is from China all the way connecting, you could say, train lines, fiber optic cable, gas lines through Russia. Another goes to Central Asia. There's another one that goes through countries like Iran and Turkey towards Europe. And then there's one that goes through Pakistan. Pakistan has its own part. It's a very key ally of China in this sense. There's another route going through South Asia, Bangladesh, India, and there's a route going through Southeast Asia, countries like Thailand, Singapore. Along these routes, train routes, investments into ICT infrastructure, airports, harbors, economic cooperation with these countries. And so this is basically, and then you have this maritime part, which is about all these different ports. We mentioned a few, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, Piraeus in Greece, Djibouti in Africa, Mombasa, all these different places where China is building this economic infrastructure. So that's the type of world it's creating. It is creating it, you could say, as a kind of alternative to many different Western institutions. So part of this is also the idea of what it calls the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which you could say is something like China's version of the World Bank. So it's creating all these competitive institutions, different from what we know, to create something of a different world order. That's its ambition. At the same time, I would argue, and I think that's one of the things I've mentioned before, China is probably going to become the biggest economy and very influential, but I don't think we truly are going to get towards something like a Pax Sinica, because I believe more in this world where you have this distributed world power. Especially because the United States for a very long time is going to remain militarily and financially, I think, the world's superpower. But Europe also has a part in this to play. India is an important country. So China will become influential, but I don't think it will become dominating like we've seen in the past few centuries from other countries.
So probably we have to change our worldview that it's not only the West that's important, but it's not that we are having the same situation maybe with all the influentials of the USA just after the World War, where we really were westernized by the USA. So it will be a more subtle difference, you think? Is that a good?
Yeah. It's you'll see different spheres. I mean, in some parts, I think there will be some attempts to try to disconnect. You're seeing it in certain parts of high-tech sectors, so maybe that's also important here for people here at the TU Delft. I mean, there are hints, say in the chip industry, there is this plan. United States, Biden is discussing this together with countries like Japan and South Korea to say, well, here, let's really try to create everything without China. So in certain fields, they're kind of like trying to say, well, this is just too critical or too dangerous or whatever. Let's see if we can separate this. But in many other fields, I think we are going to remain in this field where we have this globalized world where all these different economies are trading with each other a lot. China being a very important part of that. So I think that's part of it, that where we're going to see more subtle. We have conflict with China, but we're also going to cooperate with it, trade a lot with it. And I think what it's also, when you mentioned comparing it with, say, US supremacy, I think what it's also going to mean for many of us in Europe, the Netherlands, in the United States, is that we will need to rethink the extent to which it's natural for us to think that we're superior. And even if we say for ourselves, well, no, of course not, everyone's equal, we have these mental, these shablons in our head that easily translate into this.
It's maybe our history.
Yeah, it's we've grown up with this. So a very simple thing is we have an opinion on everything that goes on in China, right? And we just have to mention Uyghurs, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Every single person will have a view and a critical view of what's going on in China. Now imagine every single Chinese person having a critical view on everything that happens in Dutch Parliament. Just try to. I'm not saying if it happens, but just try to imagine what that would feel like for us. That you're going on a holiday to China, and someone will say, "What's going on with this guy Geert Wilders? The things he says about people in your country and migrants, we can't have that in China because for us it's all about stability. Yeah, we can't really have this adversarial politics." I'm not saying we're talking about whether they're right or wrong. What I'm talking about is, can we imagine that just as easy as we can tell the rest of the world our values are universal, you should follow them. How would it feel if others were to claim that same position? And that, I think, is really going to be difficult for us, to have this idea that, well, next time the Chinese leader comes here and he'll start asking us about human rights here, for instance, or about values that China thinks is important. These kind of things are still, I think, deeply ingrained, considering seeing China as a country that, for instance, can be innovative, can be have a positive role in the world. These are things for us are very hard to imagine. And I think that's something we need to get used to more.
Okay, thanks for your story. I will give the floor back to Klaas and he will ask you some last questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Meerte. Yeah, for sake of time, I'm going to keep it short. I have two last questions that I want to ask you. This has been a fairly academic conversation so far. Understandably, you're an academic, we're at a university. I want to ask you about what the rise of China and its increasing influence means for instance, the Dutch Chinese community, for generally people of East Asian or Southeast Asian descent in the Netherlands, in Europe, in America, who, we've seen news reports of increased instances of racism and discrimination because of the coronavirus. It originated in China, in Wuhan.
The China virus, as Donald Trump said.
Exactly, and people started yelling on the street. Do you see this increasing in the future?
Yes, I do. I think it's. I mean, there are a few things to consider here. I think, first of all, that's what we just talked about. We have this long legacy of prejudice against China. And that's we've already had lots of things recently about this in Dutch media, also having like these classical stereotypes about Chinese people, or even Dutch swear words. We've had that for a while, and we now need to learn that, well, they won't take this anymore, just like we had in the past. That it was so okay. Well, that's just okay. So these voices are getting more vocal and being more heard. At the same time, it's now also, as China becomes more influential, it's going to connect. In the past, we had prejudices about Chinese, oh, they're just hardworking or uncreative or that kind of things. Now it's also going to be combined with more fear. Oh, it's such a powerful country, and it's so influential, and it's are they listening in on us? So I think the classical stereotypes will also be, I fear, more infused with fear. The a kind of mold for that is this idea that you had already in the 19th century and earlier on, this idea of the yellow peril, of this evil Asian power of like mechanistically trying to take over the world. We have a lot of also cinematic stories about evil Chinese or Japanese leaders. So I think these kind of images are going to come back. They even date back to the Mongolians, by the way, this idea of the yellow peril. That's going to increase, I think, because of this global rivalry, which I think is something we need to be very careful about, because indeed we have a lot of people here in the Netherlands, in all the parts of the world, that are going to bear the brunt of this dynamic. It is increasing. I think the good news there is I think that this group is also here, at least here in the Netherlands, increasingly becoming more vocal. You even have with the new public broadcasting suggestions. There's even one for an Asian new television channel, and certain writers are speaking more about the experience of being Chinese Dutch or other types of people with Asian heritage. And I think it's important that we be careful for what's and be sensitive to what's going on with these type of people. Also because they're important, not just as citizens, but also as people who move between both worlds. And I think that's going to be increasingly relevant. My fear is that we are going to see much more thinking in terms of dichotomies: us, them, West, East, China, Europe, or West. These people inhibit the ground between. They both share a lot with us, and they have Chinese descent. So this, I think, is really important. Having the people who live in the middle, or who know both worlds, can help us evade this strong thinking in terms of us versus them.
Right. So they have an extremely valuable cultural experience bridging between the two.
As a bridge, absolutely.
So what about, final question then? What do you think about the TU Delft and other universities in the Netherlands and their policies towards, for instance, Chinese students, Chinese researchers? There's a lot of talk recently in Delft about the ties of certain researchers with universities in China that have links to the military. And people are thinking out loud about policies of how do we interact with them, safety concerns.
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I don't really have an easy answer to this, other than that we need to be very specific case by case in understanding what is at stake here. I mean, this is very difficult because we have here the value of academic freedom,
Right.
and that's what it's. That universities are not nation states. Universities, it's all built on this idea of this global enterprise with researchers, students moving freely, sharing ideas. At the same time, and that's happening with China, but it's happening with many parts of the world, this is increasingly also being used as an instrument for state power. I mentioned this world of geoeconomics, so that also has a lot to do with high tech. It's seen as something that's critical for the power of countries. So indeed, governments are getting involved. China indeed is also, there are ties in cases with academic institutions. So I don't think we can really say something here in very general terms. Well, not cooperate or easily cooperate. What I do think is that, first of all, we need to really, in a case by case, see what is at stake here. What are we talking about? and really let the debate be about what is going on at that concrete issue. Because what I do see very often, and I've heard that also from different colleagues here, that they are working on something which is completely it's safe. There's nothing real. But as soon as it gets out, the idea is, oh, we're cooperating with China, a Chinese institution, a Chinese company. Easily the whole opinion is, well, let's just don't do it because the bad press that it gives. Right. And I would at least hope that we value every case on its merits. Is it in this, if it is a security risk? Well, yes, then be careful. But at least not in a very rough sense, belief in this idea, well, it's always bad or it's always allowed.
Right, because that's a slippery slope when we start excluding people at the local level and then at the national and international level. All right, well, I want to thank you for your talk today and for answering our questions. I want to thank the people at home for watching this. I would invite everybody who's seen this to think about these issues, especially if you're studying here as well. What does this mean for your future and your career choices, etc.? And of course, as a person. If you want to know about the rest of this series, the World at War lecture series, please visit sg.tu delft.nl, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.